Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was an anime I really overall enjoyed. The anime is a big reunion for the main cast of the original 2010 live-action film, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. While the film did not reach a massive audience and was a bomb at the time, I really enjoyed it. I saw this movie on opening night and it was just me, my dad, and one couple. The rest were empty seats. But of course, over time, thanks to DVD sales, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World would become an iconic, beloved film. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World piqued my interest due to Michael Cera starring in it, since I loved his role of Evan in the film Superbad. Not only that, but promotional material like Scott Pilgrim vs. the animation got me really interested in it too. It was the Scott Pilgrim short, which adapted the beginning of book 2, that made me desire more of animated Scott Pilgrim. I really thought that's what the Netflix anime would have ended up being. However, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was not what I expected at all. Takes Off was marketed to look like a direct adaptation of the graphic novels written by Bryan Lee O'Malley for Netflix, but the show goes in a very bold direction. I knew that Takes Off would be different from the Scott Pilgrim books, game, and movie, but I didn't know how much it would stray away from the source material. My view of it from the few clips I saw from the trailer was that it'd be a more faithful adaptation of the books, with new additions, but I was wrong, as the show subverted me and many other fans' expectations. Despite the anime being vastly different from the main story, it's still very well received by critics and fans. But is it perfect? Let's find out. The first episode of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is interesting. While it covers the first book, there are little hints in the show that allude to it straying away what happened in the original film. It does not open with the opening announcement of Scott Pilgrim dating a high schooler, but rather with a new Sex Bomb song titled I Feel Fine that introduces all the characters via text. Dialogue is different as well. For example, instead of talking about Pac-Man being originally called Puck-Man, Scott talks to Ramona about the 90s Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons, which he notes both starred Jaleel White.
Maybe you didn't watch cartoons, or you're not into chili dogs.
This didn't shock me or anything, since Bryan Lee O'Malley made it clear the anime would not 100% reuse dialogue, since this is a different adaptation. Then there's one change that made business sense, where Ramona delivers DVDs for Netflix instead of working for Amazon like in the comics or the movie, which is because Prime Video is a competitor to Netflix. Still, despite some dialogue changes here and there, the first episode seemed to follow the plot of the beginning of the movie and the first book for the most part. At first, I thought the show would be a direct adaptation with some bigger changes. The scene of Matthew Patel and Gideon Graves talking to each other prior to him fighting Scott definitely made me think that'd be the case. Still, when I watched the episode, I noticed something was definitely off, especially since in this show, Crash and the boys do not show up to perform like they did in the comic and movie. We then see Scott and Matthew Patel are about to fight, and it appears he has killed Scott. Somehow, Matthew has won. That scene shocked me and got me hooked on the rest of the show. This new what-if story that Takes Off tells after episode 1 is definitely one of the positives of this Scott Pilgrim adaptation. Episodes 1 ending intrigued me, but after finishing episode 2, it really sold me on the story of the anime. Scott has a funeral, solidifying that the plot of this show is radically different from the comics and movie. An interesting detail I noticed is that Envy Adams goes to his funeral and performs a song. The part of the episode I loved the most, though, was Matthew Patel's role in it. Matthew wins the fight, but Ramona rejects him, leading to him realizing the so-called rules of the League of Evil Exes were a sham. He then calls a meeting to all the evil exes to report his findings. It's here we get funny banter between all the exes, which was absent from the books and movie. Gideon then reveals to Matthew that his plan all along was for the exes to get Ramona for him. This leads to Matthew becoming more upset, and he fights Gideon for the League of Evil Exes and his business empire. Gideon ends up signing everything away and losing everything to Matthew Patel. Speaking of Matthew Patel, this leads me into the second positive. The show fleshes out the evil exes a lot more, and they aren't one note. In the film, the exes are really funny and are all pretty memorable for the most part. However, they get punched by Scott all throughout and do not make a return. I am glad that the evil exes get way more to do here. I absolutely love the interactions the exes had in episode 2, and most of them get their own episodes in this anime. However, rather than them all being defeated by Scott like in the comics and movie, they are dealt in another unique way. In the anime, Ramona ends up talking to all of them in order to find out which one of them captured Scott after she realizes he's still alive in subspace. This starts with Roxy Richter, who Ramona has a fight with inside of movies in the video store Kim works at. It's a really nice battle sequence. The fight comes to a close though without Roxy getting turned into coins. Ramona ends up apologizing to Roxy for not properly breaking up with her after she moved out of their shared apartment. It's a really sweet scene. I found it hilarious how Roxy tries to get with Kim, but unfortunately, Kim feels nothing, and then Roxy just bursts out of the store, humming the hamster dance. Really love her characterization in this show. Besides Roxy, another great character who gets a moment with Ramona is Lucas Lee. He gets an awesome montage of his own at the start of episode 4, where he skates to the tune of United States of Whatever, which introduces him as a character extremely well. In this episode, we learn Lucas's career is dwindling, and his last chance in a movie is the role of Scott Pilgrim. The film got written by a mysterious figure while young Neil was asleep. This is this anime's way of paying tribute to the original film. However, in this universe, Edgar Wrong is directing the film instead of Edgar Wright. Besides Scott Pilgrim vs. the World's director being referenced, two of his actors from his film Hot Fuzz, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, play security guards, which is a neat reference. I really love Lucas's episode a lot, especially the second skating montage set to Police Truck by Dead Kennedys as he flees the paparazzi. Lucas Lee would definitely fit right in with a Tony Hawk Pro Skater game. Ramona ends up rescuing him from the paparazzi, but his career is over. He feels sad that he's a nobody, but she attempts to cheer him up by saying he was a nobody she used to make out with. The two end up being on decent terms again, which is really great to see, with the show solidifying that it's Ramona's story and not necessarily Scott's. But yeah, overall, Roxy and Lucas are honestly the only two exes Ramona gets some major closure with. Still, the exes Todd and Gideon get their own funny stories. Todd ends up cheating on Envy Adams with Wallace Wells, who plays himself in the film and ends up getting a bi-awakening. This happens in a mockumentary episode focusing on the failed production of a Scott Pilgrim film that Lucas got fired from. It's a really funny episode and made me chuckle a lot. Wallace constantly saying "wanna run" lines in my trailer all throughout this episode made me laugh out loud every single time. The episode ends with Todd falling in love with Wallace, but him rejecting his feelings, viewing it only as a short fling. Ramona then confronts him in the end, believing that he took Scott through the vegan portal, but Envy and Todd reveal that this is a more advanced portal. While a return of the vegan police arresting him would have been funny, this episode added a new layer to his character. Then there's Gideon Graves' origin story, which gets revealed. He used to be a nerd called Gordon Goose, who became a rich gazillionaire villain after being rejected by a popular girl in school. He ends up getting in a relationship with Julie Powers, which is an interesting pairing to be sure.
Now clean my f***ing house, Gordon! right away!
Ramona ends up being surprised by this news and acknowledges that as Gideon, Gordon was very controlling and emotionally abusive towards her. After leaving Julie's house, she ends up telling Gordon to treat Julie better than he treated her. Most of the exes are utilized great here, aside from the Katanagi twins who do appear but don't get an episode between them and Ramona. Besides the evil exes, I also love the stuff the supporting characters did. After Scott's apparent death, Knives Chow slowly becomes a part of the band Sex Bomb. She has a lot more character than in the books and film, where she mostly stalks Scott and obsessed over him. Knives ends up becoming extremely talented at playing bass and piano, which she quickly learns. Steven Stills and her end up turning Young Neil's supposed Scott Pilgrim script into a musical. Speaking of Young Neil, he's really funny in the anime. I love the scene where he rides the cart in the movie studio lot and believes it's called a Mario Kart. While Scott is barely in the show, I still really enjoyed it. That's because the supporting cast is full of very compelling characters. Scott got the main focus in the film, so Sex Bomb and the supporting cast was mostly along for the ride. Here, almost everyone gets to do fun stuff that never happened in the films or graphic novels. Finally, the last positive I have to talk about is that this is a brand new and unique thing for the franchise. It's essentially an animated sequel to the movie with the same themes but from a female perspective. The twist at the end of Whodunit is that future Scott, voiced by Will Forte, traveled to capture his younger self. He did this to prevent him from marrying Ramona, which he ends up succeeding in doing after defeating the evil exes. However, sadly, Ramona leaves him, leading to him becoming a more nervous wreck than when Envy Adams broke up with him. Future Scott is a loser and formed an unsuccessful band with the Katanagi twins. It's here we also see an older Wallace Wells. The funniest moment in the anime for me is when there's a bait and switch joke. It appears that Scott is about to reveal that Wallace and him are married, when in reality, his husband works at Nintendo.
Wallace's husband works at Nintendo. Where they make the video games?
Yes.
Does he get every game for free?
Yes. He doesn't. That's not true.
Scott even sees the events of the story play out through the robot who he was controlling in the show all along. It's here he realizes his Ramona cares for him. Another very interesting reveal is that future Ramona helps Scott get back in time to meet Ramona again. Here, she's still revealed to care about Scott despite divorcing him. Future Ramona was the one who wrote the movie script, which she adapted from old Young Neil's memoir in an effort to remind Scott of the life they previously lived. Scott's return was really great to see. This is a radically different timeline from the comics and movie, but we see his growth as a person. He realizes dating Knives was wrong after his time away. Knives ends up thanking Scott for changing her life after his death due to her developing musical talent while he was away. Unfortunately, Scott and Ramona can't kiss, which they assume has to do with the fact that he does have to fight the evil exes. They all end up going to a musical based on Scott's intended life, where he fought the 7 evil exes, which stars Matthew Patel as Scott. I find it interesting how, because Scott left the story very early on, the evil exes don't care about him or Ramona anymore. However, it turns out this much older Scott has become an evil ex of his own, and put on nanomachines in his younger self's strength to create the anti-kiss field.
Nanomachines, son.
It's here he gathers all the evil exes and supporting cast, and we get to see them fight against this old evil ex Scott for a bit. Older Scott trained to be the ultimate enemy against Scott, his friends, and all the evil exes. Honestly, this is the closest thing to a proper Nega Scott fight. The movie glossed over the fight entirely and turned it into a joke, but the older Scott battle makes up for that in my eyes, at least a bit. It's a very different fight from the Nega Scott one in the comics, and it's definitely one that makes me want to believe he's a movie version of Scott. Unlike the comics, he had less time to mature as a person. Still, I will note, events from the comics did happen in the old Scott's timeline, since the robot fight with the Katanagi twins happened there, which wasn't in the movie, so maybe it's the game timeline, who knows, but Scott turning into an evil ex was a what-if story I genuinely thought about. Older Scott sends all the evil exes back, leading to Scott and Ramona taking him on together. together. It's here Scott sees the toxic version of himself and vows to never become him. Scott loses the fight, but future Ramona chews older Scott out, noting that she's upset he never reached out to her for 10 years. It's here Ramona reveals the person she's become in the future. She ends up merging with her and becoming a Super Ramona, which both Scotts recognized from Sonic. She sends older Scott back home to improve himself since he isn't ready to get back together with her future self. Finally, Super Ramona tells younger Scott the explicit message of this series. Ramona has decided she is done running away from her past and tells Scott that he must remind her that he loves her. This show ends with all the evil exes living peacefully in society. Matthew Patel becomes an actor after the success of the musical and gives Gordon his empire back. Lucas Lee becomes a barista. Meanwhile, Knives Chow becomes a new member of Sex Bomb as a keyboard player. I overall love the narrative of this anime as it's an adaptation of the source material but with a twist. However, I wouldn't say it's a perfect adaptation. Honestly, the negatives here aren't really a deal breaker for me, but they might be for some people. I get it if people wanted more Scott screen time since his name is in the show. For me, I had no issue with it personally as it revealed the show had a literal meaning. Still, the show has Scott in the name and he's barely in it. I wasn't upset about it as the show was quality, but I can understand if some people took issue with that. Due to this anime not being a direct adaptation, stuff that was mainly in the book is absent from the show. Lisa gets a small background cameo in the final episode in the audience at the musical, but she doesn't get a speaking role. Mr. Chow, Knives' father, is also absent. That's perfectly fine though, since they were all a part of Scott's story. This anime is mostly Ramona's side of the story. Still, it's a shame that we'll likely never get these character arcs on screen again since they got snubbed from the movie. Lisa at least got in the Adult Swim short, and hey, at least Mr. Chow was in the Scott Pilgrim video game. Funny how that game is sort of the most comic accurate adaptation. Speaking of which, the show was advertised to appear to be following the comic. I personally love the anime, but I figured I'd address the flaws this anime has. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off honestly isn't a perfect adaptation, but that's perfectly fine. I noticed the anime has a decent critics and audience score, but I can understand if it is polarizing for some. I know some people who are critical of it, and they have every right to not like everything about it. I found enjoyment in it, but I respect people's opinions if they didn't. The anime is not perfect. It has flaws. To me, it's only a few flaws, and they didn't ruin the experience for me one bit. I personally loved how different the anime was from the comics and previous adaptations. The Scott Pilgrim anime is something separate from the comics, movie, and game, which makes it another Scott Pilgrim thing fans of the series can enjoy. It's a fantastic sequel to the movie, and it was a perfect way to reunite the original cast. I'm glad they got new things to do rather than going through a longer version of the movie's story. Sure, it's not the definitive adaptation, but fans still have the books, movie, and game as ways to experience the original narrative. This anime, being different from the graphic novels, actually gives me incentive to fully read through the Scott Pilgrim series. I love the movie and the game, but I haven't fully read all the books.
Boo this man!
Yeah, I'm a fake fan. I know. Bryan Lee O'Malley and the show's co-creator Ben David Grabinski took a massive risk by flipping the story on its head, and I personally think it paid off. Anyway, if a season 2 of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off doesn't happen, can we please get a genuine Scott Pilgrim Precious Little musical? I love the concept the show introduced, and I really want one now. I love musicals, and the song montage made me chuckle. Please make a Scott Pilgrim musical a real thing. This has been ShadeX, and I hope you all feel nothing but good vibes.